Without question, Booker T. Washington was the single most well-known African-American of his time and may have been the most celebrated black person in the entire world.
Future educator and orator, Booker T. Washington was born a slave on a Virginia plantation on April 5, 1856.
He had to work as a young child, and so he had to juggle hours walking miles and miles to school and then rush back to work. It was very difficult, but he was determined, and that's how he learned to read and write.
Washington was allowed to attend school while working as a servant, and in 1872 he befriended the founder of Hampton Institute, who offered him a scholarship to the school.
The emphasis at school was on industrial education, on crafts, on technical skills, teaching blacks and the former slaves how to make themselves valuable to the community in a very literal way.
Washington taught at Hampton before being appointed by General Samuel Armstrong to head the newly formed institute in Tuskegee in 1881.
This was a groundbreaking endeavor because Armstrong trusted this young man to go to Alabama and create something basically out of nothing.
During the post-Reconstruction period, tensions between African Americans and Southern whites were at a fever pitch. But as evidence of racial progress, Washington was asked to address a predominantly white audience at the 1895 Atlanta Expo. The speech turned Washington into a national figure.
The Atlanta Compromise speech is viewed as controversial because he essentially said that politics was for mainstream society and the thing for African Americans was to be separate as the fingers on our hand and not involve ourselves with white society.
Booker T. Washington saw that as a bargain that he had to strike. Those who disagreed with him felt that he had conceded far, far too much to the conservative white South.
In 1900, Washington formed the National Negro Business League to promote the economic development of African Americans. 1 year later, he chronicled his life in the autobiography Up From Slavery.
Booker T. Washington's autobiography was one of the most influential books published by an African American at the turn of the century.
Washington urged African Americans to accept their unequal position in society, while secretly funding litigation for civil rights cases. In 1905, however, leaders such as W.E.B. Du Bois renounced Washington's philosophy and insisted upon full civil rights for all African Americans.
There were people during Washington's time and even now who were very critical of Washington's racial politics. Washington was willing to trade political and voting rights for economic rights. And Du Bois and others said, that's too hard a bargain.
Washington remained principal of Tuskegee and wrote a total of 14 books before his death on November 14, 1915. He was buried on the campus of Tuskegee University. William Edward Burghardt Du Bois, later known as W.E.B. Du Bois, was born in Great Barrington, Massachusetts, on February 23, 1868. As a young man, Du Bois received a B.A. from Fisk University before becoming the first African American to earn a Ph.D. from Harvard in 1895.
What is impressive about W.E.B. Du Bois, when he went to Harvard, they wouldn't accept his 4-year Fisk degree. Du Bois also faced the problem of not being allowed to stay on the Harvard campus after 6 p.m. So if you put it in context historically, it was a great feat.
While teaching at Atlanta University, Du Bois produced a number of academic works, including The Philadelphia Negro in 1899, the first case study of a black community in the United States.
Du Bois went into these blighted areas. He found a population that had terrible health issues, a lot of social ills such as poverty, high infant mortality, prostitution. He didn't entirely excuse the African American population, but in his analysis, he was very forceful about pointing out racism as a reason for a lot of these ills.
Both Du Bois and Booker T. Washington emerged as advocates of their race. However, as an alternative voice to Washington's book, Up From Slavery, Du Bois published The Souls of Black Folk in 1903.
It was an absolutely unique book. It contains poetry, autobiographical sketches, historical articles, memoir, a wide-ranging representation of the diversity of Black experience.
In 1905, Du Bois founded the Niagara Movement, opposing Booker T. Washington's racial accommodation theory. The organization became the forerunner of the NAACP, and years later, Du Bois was appointed editor of the NAACP magazine, The Crisis.
Du Bois wanted The Crisis to have two main components: protest on the one hand and uplift on the other. At the same time that he was protesting lynching and race riots, he was building a consciousness.
While continuing his work for civil rights, Du Bois published his first novel, The Quest of the Silver Fleece, in 1911. 4 years later, he published The Negro, the first general history of Black Africans.
He was one of the early scholars who felt like you could not understand the status and condition of Blacks in the United States unless you came to terms with the status and condition of Africa.
In 1920, Du Bois published the first of his 3 autobiographies, entitled Darkwater, Voices from Within the Veil. Then in 1935, Du Bois published his magnum opus, Black Reconstruction in America.
With his 3 autobiographies, and in a sense you could say his body of work, Du Bois gave us a document of what it was like to be Black in the American century.
While becoming more influenced by communism, Du Bois made a losing bid for the New York State Senate at the age of 82. By 1961, Du Bois joined the Communist Party and moved to Ghana, where he died on August 27, 1963.
W.E.B. Du Bois can be deemed arguably the most profound African-American intellectual of his generation. His ideas are still highly relevant for the present generation of scholars.
Born into slavery in Missouri, George Washington Carver was orphaned as an infant and raised by Moses and Susan Carver, the family who had owned his mother. As a frail child, he was not required to help with heavy farm chores and spent his days exploring nature and the plants at the Carver house. Soon, he became known as the plant doctor. George left the Carver home to pursue an education on his own. After 2 years, he earned a certificate of merit and would have to move again in order to continue learning. He moved 75 miles away to Fort Scott, Kansas. He worked at menial jobs while trying to save enough money for school, but his life was a lonely one filled with poverty, cruelty, and prejudice. When he witnessed a Black man being lynched, he fled. He had been accepted to Highland College in Kansas, but on arrival, he was turned away because of his race. In 1886, he settled on a farm in Ness County, Kansas. While there, he performed agricultural experiments that would later be valuable to him. George was able to save enough money for a semester at Simpson College in Iowa to study art. Out of 300 attending, he was the only Black student, and he was welcomed. He was described as having a burning zeal to know everything. His art teacher was so impressed with his ability with plants and encouraged him to major in horticulture. He transferred to Iowa State Agricultural College and graduated in 1894. In 1896, having received a master's, George was offered a position by respected educator Booker T. Washington of the Tuskegee Institute in Alabama. At Tuskegee, George decided on his purpose in life. He was going to help a former slave population become self-sufficient through farming.
Carver had been trained in Iowa in the natural sciences, in botany, and as a scientist and an investigator, Carver was a deeply practical man. He wanted to turn science into products that would benefit the Black rural poor.
He developed the Jessup Wagon, a movable laboratory on wheels to help educate farmers. He encouraged them to rotate their crops to conserve the nutrients in the soil and to give up soil-depleting cotton crops. He persuaded the farmers to plant peanuts instead. In his Tuskegee lab, he developed over 300 uses for the peanut and 100 uses for the sweet potato. anything from beverages to medicines to paints. Carver collaborated with Henry Ford in developing alternative fuels with soybeans. He also perfected a process for extracting rubber from the milk of the goldenrod plant.
Carver produced a series of scientific inventions that were primarily designed to enhance the economic and agricultural productivity of the Black Belt. They benefited black and white farmers alike.
This prolific scientist was also a painter, a crocheter, and a musician, even raising money for the Tuskegee Institute by touring as a pianist. He had once turned down the opportunity to work with Thomas Edison because he believed he would do more good at Tuskegee.
After World War I, by the 1920s, Carver had become something of a legend, a folk hero to the Black South.
George Washington Carver died on January 5, 1943. He was buried at Tuskegee next to his friend Booker T. Washington. His tombstone reads, "He could have added fortune to fame, but caring for neither, he found happiness and honor in being helpful to the world."
George Washington Carver's greatest accomplishment was in being a role model to a generation of young African American scientists who followed him.
There's something irresistible about underdog stories where remarkable people rise from humble beginnings to do incredible things against all the odds. But few stories are as dramatic as that of Ida B. Wells, a woman who was born a slave in Mississippi in the midst of the Civil War and became a daring investigative reporter and a civil rights crusader, who would one day be called the loudest and most persistent voice for truth in an era of injustice. From an early age, Wells carried exceptional burdens with exceptional courage. She became the head of her household at the age of 16 when both her parents died suddenly from yellow fever. In order to support her 5 brothers and sisters, she curtailed her education and started working as a school teacher in rural Mississippi. When she was 21 years old, Wells boarded a train to Memphis and seated herself in the first-class ladies' car, only to be told that black women were restricted to second class. Not only did she bite the conductor who tried to remove her, she soon filed a discrimination lawsuit against the railroad company. She won the initial case, and while it was overturned on appeal, an article she wrote about the experience helped launch her career as a journalist. Wells' life changed forever in 1892 when her friend Thomas Moss was murdered by a white mob in Memphis along with 2 other black men. Their brutal killings inspired Wells to speak out against the horrors of lynching, an increasingly common tool of terror used against black people in the decades after the Civil War. Black men were often falsely accused of rape in order to justify their murders, but in a series of widely read articles and pamphlets, Wells argued that lynching had little to do with protecting the honor of women and everything to do with protecting the power of Southern white men. Like so many civil rights leaders who would follow in her footsteps, including the civil rights leaders of today, her criticisms were powerful because they took aim not just at the misdeeds of individuals, but at the unexamined institutions of racism and power behind them. Her groundbreaking analysis changed the national conversation around lynching, and even her future mentor, Frederick Douglass, called his writing on the subject feeble in comparison. Wells was the co-owner and editor of a black newspaper in Memphis. After one of her anti-lynching articles displeased the white community, an angry mob stormed the office of the paper and destroyed it. Faced with death threats, Wells started carrying a pistol in her purse, but refused to back down from her anti-lynching campaign. She said it was better to die fighting against injustice than to die like a dog or a rat in a trap. After that, she relocated to New York, where she began to publish investigative journalism for an even larger audience, including pamphlets that collected statistical documentation of lynching in the South. Her popular anti-lynching speeches eventually took her to Britain, where white audiences seemed far more outraged than many of their American counterparts. Her overseas speaking tour inspired international condemnation of lynching, particularly from British newspapers and politicians, and elevated Wells to the most visible national leader in the anti-lynching movement. Although Wells often criticized herself for being stubborn and hot-tempered, those same qualities made her a fiery orator and a relentless crusader against injustice. Faced with death threats from Southern whites and criticism from moderate black reformers who considered her too radical, Wells refused to compromise her ideals for the sake of comfort, convenience, or even personal safety. "The way to right wrongs is to turn the light of truth upon them," wrote Wells, who never failed to speak unpleasant truths even when it cost her friends or potential allies. Although surrounded by hostility and threats from people who wanted to punish her outspokenness because of her race and her gender, she refused to be silenced. Although she fought for women's rights, Wells was often disappointed by white suffragists who considered racial issues a distraction from the fight against sexism. Some even endorsed segregation. During the famous Women's Suffrage Parade of 1913, when black women were told to walk at the back, Wells simply waited till the march started and defiantly joined her state's delegation. Similarly, she was frustrated by those in the black community who saw women's rights as unimportant to the fight against racism. Caught between the struggles of her race and her gender, Wells often felt like she fought alone. Although she had many suitors and withstood enormous social pressure to marry, Wells remained single throughout her 20s. In her early 30s, she finally met her match in Ferdinand Barnett, a black lawyer who was equally passionate about social justice and a man who wholeheartedly supported her career. They married and had 4 children together, and while Wells would eventually step down from her full-time position as a newspaper editor, she continued her work as a reformer until the day she died. When she passed away in 1931 at the age of 69, Ida B. Wells had profoundly changed the way people looked at race, gender, and violence in America, and transformed herself from a slave who was regarded as property to someone once described as a woman who walked as if she owned the world.